being online too often quite literally is bad for your brain. It's bad for your brain. It's bad for your body. It is not good for your mental health. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name is Mickey. I'm a therapist, and we talk about therapy things on this channel. And today we're talking about the psychology behind being chronically online. There has been a lot of chatter about this phenomenon. I would say generally, but especially post-election. There's a lot of chit chat about what's happening online, and especially about the chronically online types of behaviors. So I have some stuff to go over with you today. We are going to go over what being chronically online means, why chronically online behavior is happening, and then obviously the psychological, the emotional, social impact of the problem, and like the sort of stuff underlying that. My outline froze, so I got distracted. But I also want to talk about the surprising amount of crossover between chronically online behavior and this like very staunch form, this very like unmoving form, and also like performative form of leftism and or progressivism, and some surprising crossover between that and fundamentalism also. So we're going to get into a couple of things today. I might push y'all's buttons, but you know, it is what it is. Like I said, I came across a couple of TikToks actually that helped to spur along the research process in the video, so I'll put those in the description below. But before we get started, brief disclaimer, I am not, in fact, a Republican. I am still a leftist. I am still fiercely committed to being progressive and being inclusive, and I am not saying that no one should critique like liberal values, for example. And I think it's really important that we continue to interrogate our own biases and things like that. So please don't be obtuse. Please don't be intentionally obtuse. You get it. Anyways, let's get into, first and foremost, what do I mean when I say chronically online behavior? Let's define the thing so that we can all have a shared perspective on that. The first thing that I want to share with you is the bean soupers, right? The bean soup phenomenon. If you're not familiar, there was a whole situation that happened on TikTok. There was a wonderful human who made a recipe for a very iron-rich bean soup that was intended to help folks who menstruate replace some of the iron that they would be losing during that period of time. The recipe, as you can imagine, was for bean soup. It was made of beans. They made this recipe video and they were actually like so wonderful. This person was so wonderful and kind, but the comments were rancid. Like, first of all, with people being like, well, I don't like beans, so how come, like, what about me? But also some comments that were just saying like, you know, well, I don't like beans, so can I still make this, right? Or can I substitute the beans for something else? Or, you know, I don't like beans, so can you give me some recommendations for other things to put in this soup? There is a wonderful human named Sarah the Book Fairy, I'll put their in the description, who talked about the what about me syndrome. This was very much happening with the bean soup phenomenon. It's kind of become synonymous with this very strange and like indignant and intentionally obtuse behavior that comes up a lot when we talk about chronically online behavior. Before we go any further, I want to talk to you about this week's sponsor though, which is Delete Me. In case you didn't know, Delete Me is a hands-free subscription service that helps to remove your personal information from hundreds of data brokers online. And if you are not aware, data brokers are these corporations that take your personally identifiable information and they package it all up into profiles that they then sell. This information is stuff like your address, even your relatives' information, and it can also include things like your birthday and your social security number also. Especially during such a contentious political time where 3 out of 4 voters report fearing political violence. And Delete Me research shows that the amount of personal information available about people online has tripled between 2019 and 2023, which can be available for free, by the way, or as little as $5 per profile. It's really reassuring to work with a company like Delete Me because we can't always control who wants that information about us, but we can certainly make it harder for them to get a hold of it by being proactive. And Delete Me can help to do that by removing your information from hundreds of data brokers online. And they also will continually monitor those sites for you all year long. So they keep your information removed, and that can help to protect you and your data. I'm going to show y'all my dashboard right now. I show you guys this every time, and it's because every month it's shocking to me the amount of information that Delete Me finds and removes, both new stuff and things that Delete Me is continuing to remove for me. We all know that I have strong feelings about my privacy, and I'm just really grateful that Delete Me is helping to keep my private information private. Thankfully, Delete Me has a special code for all of my followers. You can get 20% off of your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/Mickey Atkins and use promo code Mickey Atkins at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/Mickey Atkins with code Mickey Atkins. Thank you so much to Delete Me for sponsoring this week's video. Let's go ahead and hop back in. Okay, so like I said, there is a greater conversation to be had about media literacy and critical thinking here, because rather than using critical thinking skills to engage with content and just understand that like maybe this isn't for me, it instead turns into this chorus of seagull-like voices of like, what about me? What about me? And it's, first of all, maddening, but also it's not an isolated phenomenon. These are things that I've seen on content, not even necessarily on my channel. I have seen it on my channel. We're gonna talk about that in a second, but on content that's like not even made really in my like sphere of influence. For example, a plus size swimwear review. There were so many comments underneath it about how, you know, this company doesn't make stuff for people who are under size 12. And so don't you think that's like disrespectful to us? Or, I really like this type of swimsuit. It's hard to find one in this style in my size. And so why are you flaunting yours when I can't have one? Or like, they don't make swimsuits for people under size 12. And so what about the rest of us, right? How come they're ignoring the rest of us? And this in a world where like finding plus size clothes at all is a feat, really, let alone ones that are current and follow current trends and that make people feel comfortable and don't adhere to these fashion ideas about fat bodies being disgusting and gross and needing to be covered up, right? So this chorus of voices underneath this swimwear review is like so confusing, but I think a great example of what this chronically online discourse looks like. On my channel, for example, I'm going to put some of you on blast. I've gotten comments about, I don't like hearing curse words, so you shouldn't use them. Or on the video that I did about CBT, where I said that as a clinician, I don't like using CBT because I have issues with it. There was a comment about how like, don't you think this is so rude and disrespectful to all of the people who have found CBT to be helpful? Like, what about them? I made a video about QAnon that pushed a lot of people's fucking buttons. And there were a couple comments, not just about gardening and homesteading, but about several things that I discussed as being part of the, blank to QAnon pipeline, of folks saying like, well, I have a garden, right? Or like, I homestead and I've never seen QAnon content. I am not into QAnon. And like, okay, that's not the point of the video. I also, on a video that I made about kink inclusive sex ed, there was a comment from somebody saying, why are you talking to us kink experts as though we're newbies? Like, that's so rude of you. This is what I'm talking about. Instead of using critical thinking to ground themselves in the reality that like, oh, if this person, for example, in a kink inclusive sex ed video, if it feels like they're not talking to me, maybe it's because they're not talking to me. It instead becomes this self-righteous indignation about how you're ignoring me or you're treating me poorly or you're being rude to me, right? I think this is partially an effect of the toxic individualism. We've talked about this in regard to the United States. I know that not all of you are from the US, but the United States in particular, I think, has been stained by the like capitalism bootstraps kind of mentality, this like toxic individualism thing that we're all supposed to like, every man for himself kind of a thing. For what it's worth, there is also something to be said about some people becoming adults during a time where social gathering was unsafe, during the quarantine and things like that. People have talked about this in regards to concert etiquette. These folks who became adults during quarantine that don't know how to engage socially in that setting, being very rude and being very disrespectful to other people's space and like getting in other people's space and running into other people and things like that, screaming in people's ears. A lot of this is a side effect of having grown up in a time where they weren't able to engage socially and do the social and emotional learning that a lot of us do gradually over time. For what it's worth, I think this is a great dovetail for us to talk about third spaces because in case you didn't know, if you're new here, hi, I'm fanatical about third spaces. I think community is very important. We talk about it a lot. And actually so much so that I have a Discord server, by the way. If you want to join that, you can join the Snosh Blossoms level and above on the Patreon or the channel memberships. But I think community is very important because in third spaces, it provides us with an opportunity to do that type of social learning where we're being challenged, right? We're sort of bumping into other people who have differing perspectives than us, and not just in a like challenging our own biases kind of way, not just in a like challenging our own, stereotypes and whatever, but in a like your experience is just different than my experience. And so in conversing with you, I am now forced to sort of take that on board and expand my worldview to include your experience, which I previously did not. This type of conflict in third spaces is a very valuable teacher for us, and it forces us to sort of live in the discomfort of like, oh, I didn't realize that that was a thing that happened. And so I now am sort of relearning and like retooling my understanding of community and the world around me to include this new thing. In a time where we are now becoming, I think, more acutely aware than ever about the danger of echo chambers and things like that, it's really important for us to address the way that being stuck in our own little bubble. For those of you that don't know, the internet continues to function and make money by showing us shit that we're probably going to click on, right? Things that we want to engage with. They figure out what we want to engage with based on what we've already engaged with. So it just shows you more of the same shit, right? It's confirmation bias, but monetized. This turns into, actually I've seen conversations about this resulting in something called a solipsistic mindset. It's essentially like selfishness, but at a greater, wider scale, in a more philosophical sense. Essentially, so as to say, like, my worldview, I can only know my own mind. And so therefore, that is the whole world, right? The takeaway then becomes that everything that I consume on the internet is from my own perspective. And so therefore, everything is from my perspective. And it also should be about me. It should include me. And it should be something that I can relate to. When we all know, like, when we use critical thinking skills, that's not actually true. Okay, the second type of chronically online people that I want to talk about are the intentionally obtusers, right? We talked in the trigger warning video about the insistence that someone would account for all potential extenuating circumstances of somebody's life or triggers, and a shock and horror also at encountering a generalization, something that doesn't take up every nuance possible in the entire world. And also that will result in this strange sort of hall monitor-like posture where people are like sounding the alarm and at other people for any infraction, no matter how small. This ultimately just devolves into a shit fight, usually, about who is the most progressive person and who is the bestest progressist of all and the most leftist human to exist, so that we can sound the alarm and point our finger at this person who has made an infraction and label them, shame them as not as progressive as the rest of us, and label them as part of the undesirables, right? Like, put them off in a corner with all the other people. That leads us to the point in the video that is probably going to piss some of you off, but I think it's important for us to talk about anyways, because I want to take a brief pause to discuss the shocking similarities between this particular breed of very performative leftism and evangelicalism / or fundamentalism. Because there's a lot, actually. There's a lot. Hang with me. We're going to try to run through them quickly, but there's a lot, and I think they're worth discussing. The first thing that I want to talk about is vertical versus horizontal morality. Talked about this in the Duggar family video because the Duggar family had a really strange attitude after one of their sons was found out and convicted of harm to minors. I can't really say the word, but you know what I'm talking about. That person, after being convicted, their family, the Duggar family, was just sort of like, well, we've all sinned before, which is a crazy thing to say when your child has been convicted of the horrific things that their child had been convicted of. But a lot of people who are familiar with fundamentalism have talked about it's likely a byproduct of vertical morality, which vertical morality in fundamentalism orients folks upward toward a god, towards a deity, right? It asks the question, what are the rules? And sometimes how close can I get to breaking the rules without getting in trouble? What are the rules and what infractions are going to get me in trouble, right? And in the case of a rule break, a rule infraction, the victim of that is God. Right? The victim of you breaking the rules is actually God, because you've hurt God, you've wounded God by breaking the rules and by, defiling his perfect order. By the way, in case you didn't know, I have the sweatshirt I'm wearing says girl defiled. It's very funny. I have this and a bunch of other merch in the description. That's really funny. So if you're into shitty jokes about evangelicalism, go check that out. But the reason that I bring this up is that the hall monitor phenomenon, the finger pointing thing that we talked about in leftism, is surprisingly similar, right? It doesn't orient you upward toward towards a God, but it does sometimes orient you upward towards all of the other more progressive people than you that we sort of idolize and hold up on a pedestal as being better than you, and asks the question, when you do something that is not perfectly progressive, how have you wounded those people? Often the victim in this scenario too is your reputation, right? It's either your reputation or the people above you, again, who we sort of idolize as being perfect progressivists. You get it. Rather than looking around to assess like who the actual victim of this is, which brings us to horizontal morality. Horizontal morality, in contrast, asks the question, if I have done something that violates my own moral code, who is the victim of that, right? It also encourages us to take on the tenets of that belief system as our own. So when we do something that's shitty, we have now violated our own moral code. And it prompts us to do the critical thinking of like, that sucks. I did a thing that violates my own moral code. And in looking around to survey the damage, it seems as though I have wounded someone. And so how can I, first of all, fix this, right? How do I repair this? How does the victim of this infraction or violation of my moral code want this to be repaired? And how can I prevent this from happening again, right? What steps do I need to take to improve myself so that I don't violate my own moral code again and so that I don't harm someone in my community or in my space? The contrast here is very important because it encourages us, again, to not just take that on as our own, but also to stop looking upward for the purpose of being seen as like one of the good ones, but rather actually surveying the material impact of our actions, of our thoughts, of our biases, of our opinions, and to get it straight, right? Like get your shit right. So in asking the question, like, what the fuck is that about, right? Where is this coming from? Why are leftists or progressivists carrying this vertical morality maybe into their perspective? I think for what it's worth, a lot of us probably carry this into our moral compass development as a byproduct of having been raised in evangelicalism or fundamentalism, right? If you are a person who's deconstructed in any regard, you might have accidentally brought that with you without really knowing, mostly because we don't really talk about this, and I think that's a fair thing to not know that you're bringing with you. It often can be part of this journey where we feel compelled to find rules, right? It's a common issue in deconstruction where when we leave and abandon that old moral code, right? Like the Bible for a lot of us, there's a fear about like, well, how the fuck am I supposed to know if I'm a good person, right? We often are sort of pushed to develop our own moral compass and figure out like, what do I think a good person or a bad person is, which is very scary, can be very overwhelming. But if we're not aware that we've brought that vertical morality into it, then it can cause us to view things in a way that is not ideally focused on the harm that we're causing to those that we're in company with. We might also have an unprocessed shame wound, right? Sometimes shame, childhood or otherwise, shame, a byproduct of trauma, childhood or otherwise, can affect our sense of identity, right? Often we're going to see this manifest in the like, I need to be a good boy or a good girl or a good person thing. It will cause us to feel as though our worthiness as a person is wrapped up in the way that we behave, right? Our actions, our behaviors dictate who we are as a person and who are like what our worthiness is. And that's a problem because the truth is that you can be a good person who does shitty shit sometimes, right? This is a fundamental truth that a lot of therapists walk people through every day. But shame causes us to feel as though if we've done shitty shit that we are therefore shitty shit. And that's not true. This is also, for what it's worth, very relevant in regards to doing anti-racism work, right? White people seem to be particularly afflicted with this desire to be one of the good ones, right? Right? We need people to tell us, that was a Freudian slip. We need people to tell us that we are good and okay and to offer us an absolution, right? The shame wound often causes us to look upward to those that we perceive as being in power in order to offer us some kind of absolution from the way that we feel as though we are lacking. The truth is that finding our own sense of worthiness is actually the way that we are going to be able to best engage with those around us and actually cause the least amount of harm. When we feel empowered, when we feel grounded in who we are, we feel a strong sense of self, it's going to make a whole lot more room in our interactions with others to be able to engage thoughtfully and also to be receptive to people's criticism of us, right? We are much more receptive to critique when we are grounded in our sense of self and our worthiness because we can say, you know what, you're right. That was shitty. That was fucked up. I do know inside that I am a good person, and therefore I don't want to do that again. Therefore, I can see that that sucked. And so again, I'm going to take the steps to look around and ask the question, how do I stop doing that? How do I prevent that from happening again in the future? The second thing that I want to talk about, the second surprising parallel, if you will, is this demand for perfectionism, or demand for perfection, rather. In religious fundamentalism, we see this as obviously you need to be adhering to all the tenets of the Bible. In fundamentalism particularly, it's you need to adhere to all commandments in the Bible, otherwise you're not a real Christian, right? We're going to talk about that later. In progressivism, though, we saw this, especially like in the lead up to the election, we saw this manifesting as you're not a real leftist if you vote for Kamala Harris, right? Or if you don't refuse to participate in voting at all, because the voting structure is founded in a government that is inherently white supremacist and racist, and so therefore participating at all is defiling the graves of victims who have been harmed by that system. Which is true, I guess, in theory, but the reason that we're discussing the issue with this perfectionism is that it causes us to sort of exist in this in theory world when the reality is that we exist in a material one, right? In progressivism especially, the issue is that people will often get pointed back to, famous or influential progressive literature rather than discussing okay, yes, that's great. And also we need to apply that to an in real life scenario right now that is very nuanced and that has a lot of different needs. There's a lot of different needs and interests and considerations to be made for this situation. We can't just apply one for one the exact doctrine of a piece of literature to real life because real life doesn't adhere to literature in that way. We have also seen this manifest in leftist and progressivism circles in regards to the holidays. I've seen some rhetoric about how those who are celebrating the holidays or, going home to see their families or whatever are not real leftists because there are people who are struggling. There are still very much people who are struggling. There is still very much a genocide happening in Palestine and in the Congo. And while those are real, this insistence that if you, for example, celebrate the holidays with your family, that you are not a real leftist, that you're causing harm, and that you're believing or spreading lies from the enemy, all of this rhetoric sounds strikingly similar to the way that fundamentalist Christians will character assassinate progressive Christians by saying that you are causing harm, that you are spreading lies from the enemy, and that you are not a real Christian, right? The rhetoric here is strikingly similar, and it's important for us to pay attention to, especially in a time where a perfectionist and very in theory approach can very much cause more harm than good. And when I say that it can cause more harm than good, by the way, what I mean is that a harm reduction approach is often going to be more inclusive and also going to incorporate more folks into the fold and offer them an opportunity to learn about the values, the beliefs of a movement, for example, progressivism. And so embracing a harm reduction approach can very much be a very valuable way to improve and increase the buy-in for folks who might not be there yet, but are certainly on their way to getting there. For example, a Christian calling somebody a non-believer because they are using, the NIV Bible instead of the King James Bible feels very much like somebody getting in an influencer's comment section and demanding a public apology because they used the word homeless instead of unhoused, right? Sort of splitting hairs at this point, but ultimately this is more about reputation than it is about real material impact, and that's part of the problem. It's more about getting applause from all of your buddies and an attaboy for haha, I really got him on that one, than it is about actually doing the work. And that's the issue with this perfectionism, is that again, it causes us to look more, pat on the back from people for being the most progressive, the most leftist of leftists, rather than it is about, for example, bringing more people into the movement, embracing that a harm reduction approach is very much a valid means of engagement for some folks, and that while not everybody is going to be a perfect leftist or a perfect progressive, that having people be those people and be open to learning about those things is still valuable work that's being done. For what it's worth, this also reminds me a lot of the big kerfuffle that happened in the early 2000s. If you were a vegetarian or a vegan during that time, you will remember that there was a lot of really actually hateful and shitty rhetoric flying around about how people who were vegetarians rather than vegans weren't real animal activists, or, people who were pescatarians, or at the time there was a thing that people, I don't, probably is still a thing, that called themselves like vegan-ish, right? That they were mostly plant-based, but that they, would incorporate animal products here and there, especially if it was necessary for them because they lived in a rural area, or because they had kids, or, dietary restrictions or whatever, because they just wanted to. And that the attitude from people who were strictly vegan, right? Freely the banana girl comes to mind, was that's not good enough. And so you're not you can't sit with us. You're not part of our community. You're not a real one, and you're not really adhering to the values. And so therefore get out. This attitude is very harmful, telling people to get out of your movement that they are participating in, just not in the perfect way that you think you ought to be, is in fact causing harm to the movement that is supposedly being done. And again, is more about the reputation, is more about the attaboy, than it is about the actual movement itself. Along with that, I think baked into this is the false assumption that perfection will lead to change faster, which is not true, right? Especially when we're talking about politics and social, political progress in the United States, especially. Progress is something that takes decades, centuries to actually achieve. And so again, insisting that people participate perfectly in order to accelerate that timeline is just not a real or helpful expectation. The civil rights movement, I think, is a great example of this, because consistent connection to and fidelity to the social and political reform or religious doctrine is likely going to be a lifelong journey for folks. It's going to be the long haul. And it's more important that if you're going to keep people engaged and participating in that pursuit, that we embrace and affirm that imperfection is actually a very normal and, I would argue, common part of existing in that community. The reason that I bring your attention to this is because that type of dogmatic thinking is very dangerous. I have looked at a lot of interesting research actually about that kind of dogmatic thinking, and the research has found that people who have a damage to their prefrontal cortex that has been associated with that type of dogmatic thinking tend to have decreased empathy and higher hostility. They lean more into punishments or a punitive orientation. They tend to be more egocentric and also blind to their own faults in a way. They are also more gullible people. And one of the quotes from the research that I found, I'm just going to read it to you directly, says, "This hostility may be readily harnessed by perceived authority figures," which we talked about in the QAnon video. Extremism and violence are bad across the board. I think we can agree about that. But a dangerous byproduct of this type of dogmatic thinking, especially because it can lead to groupthink and things like that, which it can cause a lot of harm. That, I think, is a perfect dovetail for us to talk about in us versus them mentality, which is rampant in both of these communities. The liberals to leftists is sort of similar, I think, to the fundamentalist versus progressive Christians thing. Essentially, it causes people to have to choose. In order to be one of us, one of the good ones, you have to separate yourself and be up here and look down your nose at all of the other people, the undesirables, like we talked about earlier, mostly by pointing out the flaws of other people, right? This is the hall monitor thing, the pointing out other people's issues and at other people. It does also feel very much like the, well, what about me and what about my very particular circumstance that we talked about in the trigger warning video, and the what about me syndrome thing, especially because it comes across as the if you're not inclusive enough because you didn't specifically reference my very niche and specific circumstances, that therefore you are a shitty person and gotcha, come and get this one. And no, that's not helpful. This is correlated with a cognitive inflexibility, which is very dangerous. It can lead to extremism. It can lead to stereotyping, hostility, and an intolerance of ambiguity, which is important. We're going to talk about how important our comfortability with ambiguity is later. But because the inverse is true, right? Cognitive flexibility is associated with an orientation towards love. Literally, it says in the research, an orientation towards love and a tolerance for ambiguity. I do want to be clear. The pieces of research that I'm referencing, though, are developed. They were done in reference to fundamentalism specifically, and that's not necessarily a one-for-one. And I do think it's still important for us to talk about the psychological traits that are related to conservatism, because they are strikingly similar to some of the traits that we see pop up in these very leftist and very performative leftist communities. I think this is also a great opportunity for me to pause and talk about the QAnon video. I have talked about the QAnon video a lot. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. I'll put that up here. I just keep talking about it. But we talked a lot in that video about the traits that make people particularly vulnerable to conspiracies, especially in times of uncertainty. Our brains are going to reach for a simple solution to a complex problem because it's trying to satisfy our evolutionary needs, right? We want to feel safe in our environments. We want things to make sense. We want them to be easy to make sense of. And it also can help to pacify a sense of helplessness or hopelessness, which comes up a lot, right? The existential dread thing is coming up a lot these days. So by no means is this a one-for-one. I'm not comparing leftism to QAnon, to be clear. But the reason I want to talk about the psychological traits that are present in the QAnon video is because whether you're a QAnon believer or a leftist, we all do, in fact, still have very similar biology, right? Our brains still are wired somewhat similarly, and it's important for us to be aware of how safety promoting cognitive flexibility is, for example. It's really important because it allows us to remain comfortable with being challenged, with challenging others in love, and also in sitting in ambiguity, right? This improves our ability to sort out mis and disinformation as well, because we're able to sort of sit in that ambiguity and tolerate that the truth that we might not understand the complex solution to an actually very complex problem. I want to take another brief aside to talk really quickly about the proselytizing through condensation and condemnation thing that happens a lot in both of these communities, because rather than using kindness and, empowerment and like affirming folks in order to improve their ability to understand our perspective and stress the importance of the work that we're trying to do, it does come up sometimes in both communities. In fundamentalism, obviously we see this as a, you're not a real Christian if you're not, reading the word in the way that we are and going to church and following the one true religion and like blah, 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 all of those types of things. It also comes up as a like correcting of others rather than educating others. Often the information is not shared in earnest, right? It's not shared in a like genuinely kind way, in a way that is intended to allow folks to come to their own conclusions and that encourages folks to form their own very individual and specific relationship with God. Rather, it is this very condescending and finger-pointy attitude that you need to have a relationship with God that looks exactly like all of the other people because the Bible is clear, that you need to have this perspective because of this passage and this feeling because of that passage, etc., etc. And so the information, like I said, is not often shared in earnest. And sometimes in these leftists, especially the very performative ones, it can come across in a very similar way. The information is not being shared in earnest, but rather in this very condescending way of like, you're a shitty fucking person because you don't know this, because you're not doing anything about it, and because you're not restructuring your life in the way that I am, or because you're not spending enough time volunteering or participating in a boycott or, a protest, et cetera, et cetera. You're not doing the work like I am, and so therefore you're shitty. And I'm going to share this information with you to try to spur you into action by making you feel like a piece of shit, right? That's not helpful. That's not actually sharing the information in earnest, and that's not sharing the information in a perspective that is going to embolden folks and like, what is the word I'm looking for?
Activate.
Yes, to activate folks, to spur folks into action out of a real sense of like energy, to energize folks. Oh my God, that's the word. That's not information that's going to be shared to energize folks, but rather to sort of coerce people into performing because they feel like shit about themselves. The difference is very important, especially because one of the things that I want to talk about is this is the last similarity that we're going to talk about, which is the strange fixation with a fantasy about an apocalyptic future, right? Both of these groups, when we're like on the very deep edges of the fringes here, seem to have a like very strangely preoccupied interest in this sort of like ultimate death thing that's happening. With fundies, I think we're all very familiar with their like fascination with the rapture, right? They all are endlessly with the billboards and the Jesus is coming and the end is nigh, right? They love it. They love to talk about it. And it's fucking weird. It's very strange. It's very uncomfortable. But honestly, there are forms of leftism that do feel very similar. There is a lot of language about like burning it all down and this sort of fantasy about like a post-apocalyptic future where we can rebuild things from the ground up. And it's a really odd and first of all, not realistic and not inclusive perspective, but it also is not one that is likely to happen. And so this fascination with a future apocalyptic event that will allow us to make everything perfect again and to build it all up the way that it's meant to be, it's feeling very evangelical religious, I have to say. Also has the same flair of fixation with perfectionism and with abiding by theory rather than material impact, right? There is this fascination with like needing to burn it all down in order to rebuild so that it can all be constructed according to the perfect theory, so that we can then, moving forward, demand perfectionism from everybody, rather than accepting the ambiguity and the imperfection that is likely to exist in all forms of humanity. It also has a flair of egocentrism, of hostility, and this sort of demand for abiding by the way that we think the literature ought to be interpreted. I don't think it is like necessary to say that too much of an investment in that attitude is in fact very dangerous. And so all of that said, I mean, like, let's sort of brass tacks. Why do we care, right? Because rage bait is a ginormous source of revenue, because it is one of the best ways that people are making money. Influencers, brands, large media conglomerates, like traditional news even, right? If you notice, it's very uncommon for headlines and things to feature like, we just wanted to show you some really nice news. That's not really a thing, especially now in an age where we are being subjected to another Trump presidency. You're going to notice that media headlines are repeatedly showing you this doom and gloom and awful and it's fucking the end of the world kind of headlines. And I want to be clear, there is a lot of really scary fucking shit going on. It's very important for us to be informed about that, and that's very true. And constantly being bombarded by the minutia of the way that Donald Trump is a fucking human piece of shit is not going to help you. But it is, however, going to make some folks a lot of fucking money. And so what's happening is that while we are very committed, I think wholeheartedly in a good way, in like a wholesome, like true way, in an earnest way, to progressivist movement, right? To, what is the word? Progress. Oh my God, hello. To making forward movement and progress, that's a good thing. We don't want our brains and our bodies, our emotions to be co-opted in the pursuit for making more money. It's very important that we be mindful of the way that echo chambers are being created, because the algorithm is more intelligent than it ever has been, right? We don't need to subscribe to things or necessarily even click on things in order for the algorithm to show it to us again. And so being mindful of the way that our attention can be co-opted to make other people money is, first of all, important, but especially important because if it's causing you to become further radicalized, to provoke a sense of self-righteous rage in you, to cause you to become very demanding about the perfection of others, to cause you to be very intolerant of ambiguity and to be uncomfortable with being challenged and with challenging others in a kind and respectful and loving way, that's a problem, right? It's essentially shitting on the movement that we're trying to participate in as progressives by co-opting it to manipulate the biology of your brain in order to make more money. We don't want that. Like, I think that's a fairly popular sentiment, that we don't want our biology and our brains to be co-opted in order to make more people money, and then for that to result, like the blowback of that to be negative on the progress that we're trying to make. The other issue with this is that it can exploit some of your pre-existing vulnerabilities, especially for those of us who are particularly sensitive to loneliness, depression, anxiety, other mental illnesses. Being locked in this echo chamber, this continual cycle of fucking shitty, scary ass fucking news that provokes us into a sense of rage and discomfort with ambiguity, that's going to heighten the danger that you're being exposed to. We also have research to support the fact that being online in this way increases your odds of feeling lonely, right? I am very much a person who is like firmly a proponent that digital community does count as community. And being online too often, quite literally, is bad for your fucking brain. It's bad for your brain. It's bad for your body. It is not good for your mental health. It's very important that we encounter diversity and social and emotional learning in our real, like, material lives for the health of our bodies and brains, because that's the way that our bodies and brains were wired to be. I really want to encourage people. We talked about this in the horror movie video, I think. I want to encourage people to remember that we need to put in context, or put our brain in context, right? Our brains are so new to engaging with digital content and like even like the way that we are, right? Like our fucking spines are not yet evolved enough to adequately support our bodies in standing upright, right? Evolution moves so slowly that our spines, the reason that you have lower back pain after you turn 30 is because your spine is not designed to hold your body vertically. That's how slow evolution moves. And so our brains are very much not evolved enough to understand how to intelligently engage with digital content. And so we need to provide our brain with the things that we know that are good for it, which is going outside, literally. We're going to talk, hold on. We're going to talk more about that in a second. Okay, never mind. We're going to talk about it now. We want to provide our brain with the things that we know that are good for it, which are literally engaging, materially engaging with people in a like IRL sense, but also physical movement, right? This is very important. Literally going outside, touching grass. That's a very important thing for us to do for our brains. Sunlight, green time, all of that is going to be a protective factor in terms of our mental health. They're all correlated with decreased anxiety, stress, depression, and improvements in our overall connectedness to our community, to our physical health as well. That also in literally going outside, interacting with our community, that improves our odds that we're going to make connections, that we're going to feel grounded in the actual place that we materially live. Okay, real quick, because I forgot to talk about it because I went on a rant about our brains and evolution. I want to talk about how being stuck in a chronically online loop is bad for your brain and all of us collectively, because there is a very real risk for us to be influenced by propaganda and things like that. I know that some of you are going to think that I'm like, woo, a little bit out there. I'm not. There was literal proven Russian interference in the 2016 election. This was a real fucking problem that we had. This was a very real problem that we had with Russian interference in our past elections, and especially on capitalizing on our hopelessness, our sense of like hopelessness and helplessness, and especially the fantasy of one day having a blank slate after we've burned it all down from which to build a perfect world again. That kind of nihilism is something that capitalizes or that provokes people into inaction, right? Into apathy. That's helpful for people who are trying to cook the books in terms of the people that they want in the White House, right? This is like a real issue. It's very important for us to be aware. Things like climate nihilism, right? Corporations do very much capitalize on the hopelessness and the apathy of everyday people by telling us that like there's nothing that you could do to ever fix it, and so don't even try. That's not true. That's not true. The reality is that while the impact of one single person or the impact of regular everyday people in comparison to corporations is going to be minimal, it is still important that we stay engaged. It is still important that we still care. That kind of apathy is the thing that this chronically online brain loop, this like shitty echo chamber that we get locked in causes or is created by. Whatever, you get it. My brain's melting by the time that we've made it to this point in the video. I do want to talk about some of the other negative aspects of being chronically online, mostly that it's fucking exhausting, right? Continually calling out folks. It's a lot. It's very overwhelming. It's difficult for us to maintain that kind of energy. And I think it's very important that we talk about the marathon and not a sprint attitude when it comes to progressivism and winning progress socially, politically. Again, that kind of progress is slow and hard won, and it's very important that we continue to stay engaged for the long term rather than burning ourselves out by insisting that influencers apologize for things like drinking a Coke. I don't know, like the crazy cuckoo things that are being demanded by chronically online people. Okay, I also want to talk about the fact that being invested in this chronically online, like calling people in and out, it's exhausting, right? I think it's exhausting. It's not good for your brain to be constantly engaged in this cycle of like needing to surveil the other people on the internet and surveil yourself and each other. That attitude is very much, I think it's important for us to talk about the marathon versus the sprint attitude in order for progress to be won, especially in a place where social progress is slow and hard fought. It's very important that we stay engaged for the long term. So calling people out and calling people in who are causing harm, who are perpetrating mis and disinformation, and getting in the way of progress. Those are all very important. And engaging in a balanced way, in a way that is mindful of our well-being, of others' well-being, that avoids condescension and condemnation, and that prioritizes community and is promoting our own cognitive flexibility, right? Promoting solidarity within the community. All of these are things that are important and can very much be balanced. These things can coexist at the same time. Okay, hi, hello. This is post-filming, editing Mickey. Sometimes when we film videos, I'll sit down and like proof the final product after Erin edits it. Everybody say thank you to Erin, by the way, for editing videos. And there are moments where I'm like, I wish I would have said this thing, or like, I wish I would have said this slightly differently. Normally I'm like, it's whatever, it doesn't matter. But today I wanted to sit down and film like kind of an addendum for you guys for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that I sat down and listened again to Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete? Great read, by the way. It's only 100 pages. Highly recommend. It's also available for free on Spotify Premium if you like audiobooks. Not an ad. Wish it was. But in doing that, I also ended up with a couple of things on my TikTok feed. And so I was like, and I just like wrote some notes and I want to share them with you. The first thing that I want to talk about though is post the incident with the United Healthcare CEO. There's been an interesting moment of solidarity that the internet has kind of shared. And I think it's a nice moment to stress that in wanting to move the social progress needle forward, keeping an eye out for these moments of solidarity is particularly key, especially when we talk about how things are often more about up and down as opposed to left to right. I think the United Healthcare CEO incident is a good, I don't know, like visualization of that, right? There were people in Ben Shapiro's comment section who were like, I am a conservative and I think that you're wrong, Ben. And I think, again, this is just a nice moment for us to talk about how moving the social needle forward, it's important for us to be aware of those opportunities for solidarity, especially because when we talk about the chronically online, like hall monitor posture, which by the way, I use the term hall monitor because I wanted to avoid invoking the term cop, but it is kind of cop-like behavior. At this point, I'm just going to like come right out and say it is kind of cop-like behavior or a desire to sort of be that. I want to draw folks' attention to the way that we, and I say we because I was very much this person at one point and probably still am sometimes. I'm working on it. We sometimes become these people who are essentially like using the oppressor's toolkit in an effort to try to gain that social progress, right? Which sucks. Like that's not wise, nor is it actually going to really grant us the forward momentum that we think it is, especially because in a time that is like very contentious, there's a lot of like hopelessness flying around, right? We can sometimes be trying to satisfy our own feelings of like inefficacy or like hopelessness, especially by using this very punitive method to try to harm other people rather than setting our sights on essentially like rehabilitation or a desire to sort of create that solidarity. This is why I talked about like the up and down, meaning in class, right? That's what I'm referring to rather than left to right. I know that might be confusing because we talked about vertical and horizontal morality. Not what I'm talking about in this case. I'm talking about how we share a whole lot more in common with our fellow working class individual, regardless of our political affiliations, than we do with the billionaire elites. That's what I mean. And so in trying to set our sights on wrapping our brains around a rehabilitative model of correction, rather than like a very punitive and punishment and especially incarceration focused modality, that's going to do a whole lot more as far as moving the social progression forward than just using the tools that our oppressors have been using to oppress us and our fellow human being. There are a couple of other TikToks that I'm going to link in the description, by the way, that talk about a couple other things that we're going to talk about. As always, this is a fan account for Imani from Crutches and Spice. Incredible human, by the way, always has great things to say. Go follow them if you haven't. But one of the things that they talked about recently is about how important it can be to seize these moments with people that we know, with our family or friends, because the conservative to QAnon pipeline is just that. It's a pipeline, right? It's a thing that people sort of slide down. We talked about this in the QAnon video. I am going to put it up here. But I want to encourage people to be aware of this because in Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete, one of the things that she talks about in like the very first, like the opening chapter is about how we as a society and a collective, we oftentimes struggle to conceive of a world that doesn't exist around this like incarceration model of punishment, right? We fail to really comprehend a justice model that doesn't focus on those things. And so when we try to then correct other people, we often will reach for that toolkit. And I want to caution people against doing this for all the reasons that we've already mentioned, but because like Imani talks about in the TikTok that she made, It can be a misstep when we're trying to sort of clutch people back from this cliff of tumbling down a QAnon pipeline. We're going to talk about why it's important for other reasons also, but especially in talking to your family and your friends and your community members. And I want to be clear because I have talked about this on the channel before, and I mean it. I stand by this, but I have also had people being intentionally obtuse and very chronically online trying to put words in my mouth that are not true. And I want to be clear. I am not insisting or demanding or suggesting even that people who are victims of marginalization sit down and have a conversation over coffee with the exact people who are their oppressors, right? Or people who firmly and vehemently align themselves with their oppressors. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that people who have conservative leanings but have not tumbled down the QAnon pipeline, people who have troubling voting records but have not firmly committed themselves to being part of the alt-right are people that we can very much have conversations with if it's safe for you to do that, if you have the emotional capacity and the desire to do that. Having those conversations can result in actually a lot of forward progress and momentum. And so I know that this seems sort of strange and like not really related to the video that we made, but I wanted to talk about it because it seems sort of silly, I guess, to apply it to the conversation of being chronically online and this like hall monitor cop-like posture that a lot of people take when trying to be like, you know, you use the wrong term, or, you know, how dare you not have a recipe with beans? But I do think that it's important to talk about because in wanting to be people who are part of the leftist and progressive movement, we are people who obviously desire to align ourselves with and participate in anti-racist work, anti-sexism work, anti-homophobia work, anti-capitalist work, right? All of these things. Those are things that are important and I would say central to the goal of leftism in the pursuit of wanting to preserve life and to, you know, improve people's quality of life and things like that. And so if you have that moment where you're recognizing that instant of solidarity that you might share with somebody like a family member or a friend who is not a person who is vehemently like 10 toes down, doubling down on being a shitty and alt-right and like too far gone to reason with kind of person, having conversations about why that's flawed and providing information and doing that from a place of a rehabilitative mindset, doing that from a place where you're not trying to use the oppressor's toolkit in being punitive, in being shaming, in being this person who wants to be a cop rather than to have a cop mentality be wielded at you, that it has the potential to result in a lot more forward progress and a lot of good. I would say, like, to put it simply, you have the opportunity to do good there, and I would encourage people to do that. Not just because it's important, but also because, again, for people who are wanting to be aligned with the work of leftism and progressivism, there's an incredible quote from Angela Davis's book that I want to share with you, and I will read it to you now. This says, "We can hardly move in the direction of justice and equality in the 21st century if we are unwilling to recognize the enormous role played by this system, the prison system, in extending the power of racism and xenophobia. Radical opposition to the global prison industrial complex sees the anti-prison movement as a vital means of expanding the terrain on which the quest for democracy will unfold. This movement is thus anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-sexist, and anti-homophobic. It calls for the abolition of prison as the dominant mode of punishment, but at the same time recognizes the need for genuine solidarity with millions of men, women, and children who are behind bars." This is what I'm talking about. Obviously, Angela Davis is talking about this in regard to prison abolition, and I think that's very important. Again, read the book. It's great. But I wanted to talk about this because the necessity, in my opinion, for doing the work of, you know, calling in and calling out folks who are causing harm or, you know, spreading misinformation or disinformation or, you know, just sharing shitty shit that's going to promote harm and promote violence and things like that. Calling those people out, calling those people in is very important. And I want to encourage you to be mindful of the way that you're doing it, because if you're doing it from this place where you're wanting to weaponize the same toolkit that people who are oppressors, the same people who are marginalizing us, you're using that toolkit, I would encourage you to reflect on how potentially misguided that is, because the reality is that there are alternative models for rehabilitation and alternative models for justice, right? Part of the issue that Angela Davis talks about in the book is that we want to slap a one-size-fits-all solution onto the problem rather than really being aware of the complex nature of why people commit crime, right? The reality is that when people ask for an alternative to the prison industrial complex, their assumption usually is that you have to have one answer and that will be the one that fixes it all. And that's not true, right? The reality is that in order to adequately address the issues in terms of like keeping society safe, we need to have a multi-pronged, very nuanced and complex answer for how we do that, because people commit crimes for many reasons, right? And so again, in the same way that Imani was talking about in her TikTok, I'll link that below, that people will find themselves on the precipice of falling down the QAnon pipeline. That's going to require us to be able to be people who can, first of all, let go of this very oppressor mindset of using this punitive and incarceration model of justice, but also allows us to make space for the nuance and the ambiguity, like we talked about earlier, to be comfortable with that ambiguity and that complexity that exists there. That's very important. And I want to encourage people to, again, practice promoting your cognitive flexibility in that regard, because if it's safe for you, if you're able to, having those conversations and being a person who can sit in that sort of flux, ambiguous state with people and have those conversations where we are hoping to provide them with an alternative model, hoping to provide them with education, hoping to engage them in a conversation where we can capitalize on that moment of solidarity, that is going to be a much more effective and likely lasting use of our time and our energy, rather than being a person who tries to shame and condescend to people and say, fuck you, you're a bad person, or you suck, get off the fucking internet, right? Like literally it's prison. Literally we want to send people to internet prison when they do something wrong. And that sucks. That is a white supremacist, sexist, homophobic, classist, capitalist mindset about justice that we're just repackaging to try to use for the goal of leftism. And that's not really what leftism is. That's not what progressivism is. And it is a pitfall, I think, of chronically online mindset that we fall into because we don't know how to really engage with the idea of justice or reform, except for the way that we've been taught, which is inherently a shitty and white supremacist, all the things. You get it. So that's just my addendum that I wanted to add, just food for thought, some further reflecting. That's it. Love you guys. We're going to talk some about how to promote your brain flexibility and all of that. So we'll talk about that. So I want to close out the video by talking to you about some things that you can do for your brain, right? How do we avoid chronically online brain rot? We talked a little bit about the literally going outside. Please go outside, ground yourself in your community, literally touch grass, move your body physically. Remember to put your brain in context of the way that it is evolved to receive the most benefit, and challenge those who have problematic behaviors, again, with love, avoiding the condescension and condemnation. I do have some advice in the QAnon video about how to do this, by the way. I'll link that up here. It's coming up again all over today. And also understand that no one conversation and no one person is going to be the thing, right? It's not going to be the conversation or the person that turns the tide. It's going to be a series of actions and conversations and people that add up to cumulatively over time a change in the way that we socially, emotionally, politically view the world around us. For our individual selves, I really want to encourage you to prioritize growing your cognitive flexibility. That's going to look like engaging in your community, but also diversifying your learning, right? Intentionally seeking out opportunities to have your perspectives challenged is very important. Caring for your physical body and your mind in ways that are stimulating for you are going to be very important. I know that it sounds sort of silly, but continuing to challenge your brain is an important way that we promote cognitive flexibility. I also want to encourage you to do work around your shame wounds, right? This can be done in therapy. I know that that's a privilege and not all people have access to, so we can do this in other ways. There are plenty of books, podcasts, YouTube videos, things, resources that talk about challenging our shame wounds. And so I want to encourage you to seek those out as well, because the more that we are grounded in ourselves, the more that we feel empowered in our sense of self and in our worthiness, the more likely we are to be comfortable in being challenged and to take on the feedback of other other people. But I also want to encourage you to prioritize joy. Right? Joy is very much an act of resistance, choosing to engage in things that bring you joy and to take breaks, to care for yourself, to spend time with the people that you love, and to get the fuck off the internet are so important. This is how we avoid being chronically online, is literally getting offline, right? By prioritizing joy in our lives, by connecting with our community, by engaging in like real, not the internet's not real, but like analog material pursuits is going to be really good for your brain. It's going to be very grounding for you, and it is also a worthy pursuit in regards to diversifying your dopamine, serotonin menu, right? I know that chronically online behavior has become kind of a meme a little bit, but it is also a real issue, I think, in our personal development, in our like collective development as well. So I want to encourage you to be aware of that. Obviously, if you're like a member of our community here, you've been here for a while, please know I love you very much. I appreciate you very much. And I want you to spend time offline so that you can prioritize yourself and take care of yourself. If you are struggling, by the way, if you're feeling your feels, I do always have resources in the description for finding a therapist and finding support. I want to be clear, I don't get paid from those. I just do it because I love y'all. So go check those out. If you have had trouble finding a therapist, there are some diverse resources there that might be helpful. Do what you can to show up for yourself and provide yourself with the care that you need, because you deserve it, because you're wonderful, and because that is ultimately how we continue to participate in hoping to find, forward momentum in social progress and things like that. I also want to encourage you, remember that the internet is a tool. The internet is a tool that we can use for learning and disseminating information, right? It's a thing that we can use to create awareness, and it is a thing that is still owned by billionaires. So it is a thing that can still fuck your shit up if you're not careful. Like a chainsaw is a tool, but we should use it carefully. We should be mindful about the way that we use it. So be aware that the internet, its primary purpose is still to make money off of you. And so while it is a very powerful vehicle for us to disseminate information and learn and all the things, it is still a thing that can be co-opted in a way that causes us harm. So be aware of that. Be conscientious of that. Big love to you. Thank you if you've made it through this video. It's a long one. You guys say you like the long videos, so, I hope you watched it. If you like the video, you could like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. We talk about this and like more fun pop culture things, so I'd love to have you stay for that. And then you can share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow. And I'll see you guys next Saturday. Okay, bye.